$1,000 lay there, silent, motionless, yet heavier than anything Sarah Mitchell had ever held in her hands. 10 $100 bills were neatly stacked beside the paid receipt. The edges were still crisp, not a single fold. They rested on the white marble tabletop of the restaurant. In this place, million-dollar negotiations happened every day, where marriage proposals were whispered under warm golden lights, and where Sarah had been standing for 8 straight hours today. She stood still. Too still. Her heart was pounding so loudly she felt she could hear it, not from fear, but because she understood exactly what was happening. This was not an ordinary amount of money, and this moment was not ordinary. The restaurant was nearly closed. The chairs had been stacked neatly onto the tables. The only sounds left were the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint patter of rain against the glass doors. There were no customers, no coworkers, no manager standing behind her. The security cameras have been out of service since last week. No one had come to fix them yet. Sarah knew that. She knew every corner of this room. She even knew the blind spots where no one could see. There was only her, and $1,000 that did not belong to her. She remembered clearly the man who had been sitting at this table. He was not like other wealthy customers. He didn't laugh loudly. He didn't order expensive wine. He didn't speak loudly on his phone to make sure everyone knew how important he was. He had sat there alone, his back slightly hunched, his hands trembling faintly as he held his phone. Sarah had watched his face change in just a few seconds, from focused to stunned to completely shattered. She had heard him whisper very softly, as if afraid of hearing it himself, "Critical condition." When he stood up, everything happened too fast. He tossed the money onto the table without looking or counting. His eyes were already somewhere else, at a hospital, in an emergency room, beside a child fighting for their life. Sarah knew. This was not a tip. $1,000 for a meal that hadn't even reached 300? No, this was a mistake. The mistake made by a father who was falling apart. Sarah's hand moved forward instinctively, driven by professional habit. 7 years of waiting tables had turned the motion into reflex. Money on the table meant money for her. Money on the table meant a reward for patience, for endless hours on her feet, for the dull, constant back pain that never truly went away. But her hand stopped, just a few centimeters from the bills. She thought of Ethan, her 6-year-old son, thin, sickly. Every time his asthma flared up, his chest rose and fell as if he were trying to pull the very last breaths from the world. $1,000. That was 2 months' worth of inhalers, next month's rent. The first time in months she could fall asleep without waking up at 3 in the morning and panic. She thought of the empty refrigerator at home, of the stack of bills on the kitchen table, of the anti-fatigue shoes she'd bought on credit, worn down to the point they no longer helped. And then she thought of that man's face, the face of someone who had just heard the worst words a parent could ever hear. Keep the money. No one would know. No one would notice. No one would get hurt. Right? Sarah swallowed hard. There are moments in life that are not loud. No blinding lights, no dramatic music swelling in the background, and yet it is precisely these moments that define who you are. This was one of them. No one was watching. No one was expecting her to do the right thing. No reward had been promised. There was only a quiet question echoing in her mind, more straightforward than any other sound. Who am I when no one is looking? Sarah took a deep breath. Her chest expanded, then slowly fell. She knew that no matter what choice she made, her life would never be the same. And in that moment, in the empty room, before the 10 silent bills on the table, Sarah Mitchell was about to make a decision a decision she had no idea would change her life forever, and the life of a stranger forever as well. Sarah Mitchell could no longer remember exactly when she first began to feel exhausted. Maybe it was during her second year working full-time as a server, or perhaps it was the day Ethan was hospitalized for the first time, when the doctor said his asthma was not as simple as typical cases. All she knew was that fatigue had become part of her body, like breathing, like a heartbeat. It was no longer something to complain about. It simply existed. Sarah's shift began at 11 in the morning, but she always arrived 30 minutes early, not out of responsibility, but because if she were late, Mark, the shift manager, would look at her in a way that made her feel smaller than a tablecloth. Mark liked order. He liked power. And he especially liked reminding employees that there are hundreds of people out there ready to take your place. Sarah never argued back. She couldn't. She needed this job. The restaurant where she worked was an upscale steakhouse in downtown Chicago, a place where a single bottle of wine could cost half her monthly rent. The place where the suits were pressed more sharply than the dreams of the people serving them. Sarah had grown used to being looked through. Guests talked to each other, to their phones, to the numbers on their screens, but rarely to her. She existed like part of the furniture, always there, always necessary, and always easy to replace. The orthopedic shoes she was wearing had been bought on a credit card. The salesperson said they would help ease her back pain, but after a few months, the cushioning had flattened, no different from hard rubber. Every step sent a dull ache up her spine, spreading into her shoulders. Sarah kept walking. She always walked, because every hour she could stay on her feet here was another hour Ethan could breathe more easily. Ethan. Just thinking of her son's name made all the exhaustion feel bearable. He was 6 years old, thinner than other children his age. He smiled often, but whenever he laughed too hard, he would start coughing. There were nights when Sarah sat beside his bed, counting each breath, afraid that if she closed her eyes for even a second, she might miss something that could never be undone. Inhalers, nebulizers, back-to-back follow-up appointments. Insurance covered only part of it. The rest, always the larger part, was her responsibility. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she bought something for herself. Every decision passed through an invisible filter in her mind. Does this help Ethan? If not, it was discarded. Most evenings, Ethan stayed with the neighbor, an elderly, kind woman who never complained, even though Sarah often picked her son up late. Sarah always felt guilty. But guilt didn't pay the rent. Tonight was no different. As Sarah wiped table 7 for the third time, her back hurt so badly she had to bite her lip to keep from groaning. She glanced at the clock, nearly 10 p.m. She wondered if Ethan had already fallen asleep, or if he was waiting for her again, like always. It was at that moment that Mark called out to her from the far end of the room. "Table 12, private section." His voice was cold and sharp, as if every word were an order. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted her apron, and walked over. That was when she saw the man. He was sitting alone in the VIP area where guests went when they didn't want to be noticed. The lighting there was softer, warmer, but his face was not. He was crying. Not sobbing, not drawing attention, just silent tears slipping down as he stared at the phone on the table as if it had betrayed him. Sarah stopped short. There was an unspoken rule in the service industry: never interfere with a customer's emotions. But Sarah was a mother, and she recognized this kind of pain. It wasn't disappointment, it wasn't anger. It was raw fear, the kind that hits when you realize you might lose the most essential thing in your life. She stepped closer, her voice softening naturally. "Sir, is there anything I can help you with?" The man looked up. For a few seconds, his eyes were empty, as if he didn't see her at all. Then he blinked, pulled himself together, and raised a cold wall in its place. Water, room temperature, and a steak. Rare. His voice was hoarse, tired, but controlled. Sarah nodded. She did everything right. She didn't ask questions, she didn't linger. But as she walked away, she heard him speak into the phone, just one sentence, very short. "My child is in critical condition." That sentence followed Sarah all the way back to the kitchen. And when, a few minutes later, she returned to clear the table and saw the 10 bills lying there, everything she had lived through, endured, and sacrificed, all of it, collapsed into a single moment. $1,000. One decision. And a woman far too familiar with having to choose between doing what's right and surviving. Sarah stood in front of table 12 longer than necessary. The wiping cloth in her hand had been clean for some time, yet she kept moving it unconsciously across the tabletop, as if continuing to clean would make this moment pass. But it didn't pass. It stayed, waiting for her. The 10 $100 bills were still there, silent, patient. Sarah glanced toward the entrance. The glass doors were already closed. Outside, the Chicago night rain fell steadily, reflecting the streetlights into long, blurred streaks. The man was gone. He didn't come back. He didn't look over his shoulder. She looked up at the ceiling, where a security camera should have been blinking a small red light. But there was nothing. Just a lifeless metal casing, shut down for nearly 3 weeks. No one saw. Sarah felt her throat go dry. A part of her began calculating, frighteningly fast. Her mind was used to this. It had been doing it for years. If she kept the money, she could pay for the next 2 months of medication. No more stretching Ethan's doses. No more praying every night that her son wouldn't have an asthma attack in the middle of the night. If she kept the money, she could pay the rent on time, avoiding the red warning letters that so often appeared in her mailbox. If she kept the money, she could breathe. A real breath. Oh my God. The whisper behind her made Sarah flinch. Emily, her coworker, had appeared without her noticing, eyes wide as she stared at the table. "That's $1,000, isn't it?" Sarah nodded very slightly. Emily whistled, half shocked, half thrilled. "That's definitely a tip. I mean, look at who he is." Sarah shook her head. "No, it's a mistake. He wasn't okay." Emily shrugged. "So what? He's a millionaire. No, probably a billionaire. He won't even notice." The words hung in the air. Sarah knew Emily wasn't cruel. This was simply what reality had taught them. In this world, people like them rarely get chances. And when a chance appeared, you took it. Emily leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Sarah, listen. That's your rent. That's Ethan's medicine. That's a whole month where you don't have to live in fear." Sarah closed her eyes for a second. Emily was right. Terrifyingly, she was too right. But then the man's image surfaced again. His trembling hands. His voice broke on the phone. The way he had stood up so abruptly, as if even one more second would cause his entire world to collapse. "He didn't leave the money," Sarah said, her voice nearly failing. "He forgot it." Emily sighed. "Sarah, how many people in this world forget $1,000? This is a sign. The universe is helping you." Sarah opened her eyes. "No, this is a test." Emily frowned. "A test of what?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, calloused fingers, nails cut short because there was never time for care, hands that had carried thousands of plates, wiped hundreds of tables, and rocked her child to sleep every night. "A test of Who I am, she said quietly. Emily shook her head as if she didn't believe in such abstract things. You always overthink everything. Maybe, but some decisions don't allow shallow thinking. Sarah slipped her hand into her apron pocket and touched her phone. She thought of Ethan, sleeping at the neighbor's place with the nebulizer already set beside his bed. She thought of the times he looked at her and asked in a tiny voice, "Mom, do we have enough money to buy my medicine?" Sarah opened her eyes. "He's at the hospital," she said. Emily looked up. "What?" "I heard him. His son is in critical condition." Emily was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, more slowly, "Then he needs that money even less. He's got an entire hospital behind him." Sarah shook her head. "It's not about the money." She looked at the 10 bills one last time. Then, before Emily could say anything else, Sarah picked them up. She folded them carefully, not hurried, not hidden. She placed them neatly into her apron pocket as if she were holding on to something extremely fragile. Emily's eyes widened. "You're keeping it?" "No," Sarah said. "I'm returning it." Emily laughed, a sound half joking, half helpless. "You're crazy." "Maybe." Sarah untied her apron and hung it on the hook. Her shift was over. Or perhaps something much bigger was beginning. She put on her coat and grabbed her car keys. Her heart was racing, but this time not from fear. It was because she knew she was stepping onto a path with no turning back. "Sarah," Emily called after her, her voice dropping. "Are you sure?" Sarah stopped at the door. She turned around and looked at her coworker, someone just as tired, just as worn down, just as desperate to survive day by day. "No," Sarah answered honestly. "I'm not sure." Then she opened the door, letting the cold air and the smell of rain rush in. "But I know," she continued, "if I don't do this, I'll never forget it." The door closed behind her. Outside, the Chicago night was vast and soaked with rain. Sarah hurried toward her old car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she slid into the driver's seat. The 10 bills rested quietly in her coat pocket, like a second heartbeat. She started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the restaurant slowly faded away. Sarah didn't know what awaited her ahead. She knew only one thing. In those brief 30 seconds, in an empty room with a forgotten $1,000, she had chosen to become someone she could look at in the mirror every morning. And the price of that choice, she was about to find out. The old car shuddered softly as Sarah turned onto the main road leading toward the highway. The rain began to fall heavily, tapping steadily against the windshield like a slow, patient drumbeat, unhurried, persistent, precisely like the sensation creeping up her spine. She switched on the wipers. One sweep, then two. Streetlights stretched into blurred streaks of light across the glass, making Chicago look like a city melting into a painting. By day, this place was loud and rushed, everyone wrapped up in their own business. But at night, especially in the rain, the city became strangely empty, as if everyone had retreated indoors, leaving the roads to those carrying decisions they could no longer turn back from. Sarah drove in silence. The radio was off. Her phone lay face down on the passenger seat. She didn't need any more noise. Her mind was already loud enough. Every time she stopped at a red light, her hand instinctively reached for the pocket of her coat. The 10 bills were still there, unmoved, unvanished, like a reminder that she could still turn around, take a different route, stop at a gas station, change her mind. No one knew. No one was calling to ask. No one was tracking her down. All it would take was one different decision, and her life would become much lighter. "It's just money," a voice echoed in her head. She wasn't sure whose it was, maybe Emily's, maybe fears. Rich people's money. They have plenty. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She remembered the look in the man's eyes as he stood up from the table. Not the look of someone who had just finished a meal. It was the look of someone running from the greatest fear of their life, the fear that comes from helplessness. Sarah knew that feeling. She had once sat in an emergency room, clutching Ethan's small backpack, listening as a doctor said words she never thought she would hear. We're doing everything we can. There are moments when money stops being money. It becomes just a meaningless number, powerless in the face of what you fear losing most. The car turned into the hospital parking lot. The large building rose before Sarah, a massive structure of glass and steel glowing through the rain, standing like a fortress. Cold white lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating a feeling at once safe and distant. Sarah turned off the engine. She sat still. Just 1 minute, she told herself, to breathe. She looked into the rearview mirror. Her face reflected faintly in the dim light, tired, pale, but her eyes were strangely bright. It wasn't the brightness of hope, it was the brightness of resolve. She opened the car door. Cold air and the smell of rain rushed in, making her shiver. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself and lowered her head as she hurried toward the entrance. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was completely different. No smell of food, no clinking of knives and forks. Here, there was only the scent of disinfectant, metal, and something hard to name, the smell of compressed anxiety. The waiting area was large, but not loud. Plastic chairs lined up in rows. A middle-aged woman sat with her head bowed, phone clutched in her hands, her shoulders shaking in rhythm. An older man shuffled slowly down the corridor, dragging an IV pole behind him, his hospital gown open at the back as if he no longer had the strength to care about embarrassment. Sarah stopped, feeling out of place for a few seconds. She didn't belong here. She wasn't family. She didn't have an access badge. She was just a waitress with an envelope in her coat pocket. A nurse stepped up to the desk. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were gentle, the kind of gentleness belonging to people who had seen too much pain and learned not to let it harden them. "Can I help you?" the nurse asked. Sarah swallowed. Her throat felt dry and raw, as if she had just run a long distance. I'm looking for someone, she said, her voice smaller than she intended. Michael Reynolds, he forgot something where I work. I need to return it. The nurse looked at her, her expression shifting from polite to cautious. Are you family? No, Sarah shook her head quickly. I work at the restaurant where he had dinner. This is important. The word important hung between them. The nurse was silent for a few seconds, assessing Sarah from head to toe, the simple coat, the worn shoes, the unmade face, and the tension she couldn't hide. Finally, she exhaled softly. Mr. Reynolds is in the ICU, she said slowly. His son's condition is dire. I can't disturb them right now. Sarah nodded. She had expected that. I understand, she said. If you could let him know I'm here. My name is Sarah Mitchell. The nurse looked at her once more. Then she nodded. Wait here, she said. I'll see what I can do. Sarah sat down on a hard plastic chair, her hands clasped together. Time moved so slowly it almost felt frozen. Every minute that passed was another minute she wondered what she was doing here. Outside in her coat pocket, the 10 bills lay still. They could solve so many things. But in this place, among disinfectant and fear, they suddenly felt strangely small. Sarah looked around. Strangers, lives on pause. And in that moment she realized, some decisions don't bring immediate rewards. They bring only one thing: peace of mind. She didn't know whether she would get to see the man. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that once she had stepped into this place, she was no longer running from her choice. She was facing it. Sarah no longer knew how long she had been sitting on that plastic chair. Time in a hospital moved differently. It didn't flow by minutes or seconds, but by the breathing of those who were waiting. Every beep echoing from somewhere down the hallway stretched the air tight, then let it snap back, like a cord on the verge of breaking. She held the envelope tightly in her hands. The paper had softened from the sweat in her palms. The 10 bills inside were still neatly aligned, unmoved, as if they, too, were waiting. Sarah lowered her head, looking at her shoes. Against the polished tile floor, they looked painfully worn, out of place. She felt out of place. A waitress sitting in the ICU corridor carrying $1,000 and a decision she could not take back. She began to wonder, what if he didn't want to see her? What if he thought she had come to ask for something? Or worse, what if he became angry? She hadn't even finished those thoughts when she sensed a subtle shift in the air, as if the hallway had just held its breath. She looked up. The man was standing at the far end of the corridor. Michael Reynolds no longer looked like the man who had been sitting in the restaurant hours earlier. His shirt was wrinkled, no longer tucked in. His tie was gone. His once neat hair was slightly disheveled. His eyes were red and hollow, not from crying too much, but from having gone far too long without sleep. He saw Sarah and stopped. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face as if he were trying to place her in some memory. Then recognition. "You," his voice rasped. "You're from the restaurant." Sarah stood up abruptly. Her heart pounded so hard her ears rang. "Yes," she said. "I'm Sarah." He stepped closer, slowly, as though his body were carrying an invisible weight. When he stopped in front of her, he looked at her more carefully, not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone trying to understand something. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for the entire drive through the rain. "You forgot this," she said, holding out the envelope with both hands. "On the table." Michael looked at the envelope, then at her, then back to the envelope. For a few seconds he didn't seem to understand. Then his eyes widened as realization set in. He took the envelope, opened it, and saw the bills inside. He said nothing. The silence between them was so thick it felt almost tangible. Finally he looked up, and on his face now was no longer pure pain, but shock, raw and completely unguarded. "You brought it here?" he asked slowly. "In the middle of the night? In the rain?" Sarah nodded. "Yes." "Do you know," he continued, his voice lower, "what most people would do with this money?" Sarah didn't look away. "Yes," she said. "They'd keep it." Michael let out a slight sound, not quite a laugh. "And you, it didn't." "No," Sarah said, "because it isn't mine." Michael drew in a deep breath. His shoulders trembled slightly. Then, as if he no longer had the strength to remain standing, he pulled a nearby chair toward him and sat down. He bowed his head, hands clasped together. "My son," he said, his voice breaking on the third word. "He was in a car accident. Head trauma. The doctors said, the next 48 hours will decide everything." Sarah felt her eyes sting. She didn't know what to say. There were no words that could ever be right in a moment like this. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. Michael looked up at her. "You have a child?" he said, not as a question. "I can tell." Sarah nodded. My son, he's 6. And you still came here, he said, almost whispering, with money that could help you so much. Sarah swallowed. I know. Michael looked at her for a long moment. His expression softened as if a layer of armor had just fallen away. What's wrong with your son? He asked. Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to place her pain beside his, but she answered honestly. Chronic asthma, she said. There are nights when I stay awake just to make sure he's still breathing. Michael closed his eyes. 1 second, 2. Then he opened them and there was something fragile there. I don't know what to say, he said. You have no idea how much this means to me. Sarah shook her head gently. You don't need to say anything. Michael held the envelope, then suddenly extended it toward her. Keep it, he said. Please. Sarah took a half step back, pure instinct. No, she said immediately. I didn't come here for the money. Michael stared at her, stunned. You don't understand. You deserve— No, Sarah interrupted, her voice still gentle but firm. I just did what I hope someone would do if I were in your place. Michael looked at her as though, for the first time in his life, he was seeing something entirely new. A person who didn't want to take, didn't want to exploit, didn't want to trade kindness for a reward. Finally, he lowered his hand. He let out a long breath, as if setting down a heavy burden. Thank you, he said, for being human when so many people aren't. Sarah stood there, her hands empty, yet her chest filled with a feeling she couldn't quite name. In a place where everyone spoke only of numbers, of survival rates, of probabilities, two strangers had met not through money, but through a shared fear called children. And in that moment, neither of them knew that this meeting was only the beginning. Michael did not stand up immediately after that thank you. He remained seated, both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on some invisible point on the floor. As if lifting his gaze one more time might strip away the fragile composure he had only just managed to gather. Sarah didn't rush him. She stood there in silence, giving him the space she herself had once needed during long days in hospitals. Some pains don't need questions. They only need to be respected. Eventually, Michael looked up. This time, the look in his eyes was no longer shock or confusion. It was something more bare, an acknowledgement. Do you know, he said slowly, that I've built my entire life around controlling everything? Sarah shook her head lightly. She didn't know, and she didn't need to. I control work, time, people, he continued. Everything has a plan, a backup, numbers to guarantee it. He gave a hollow smile. Until today. Michael lifted a hand and rubbed his forehead, as if trying to push away a haunting thought. One phone call, he said, and everything I believed I had under control disappeared. Sarah listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fill the space with empty comfort. For the first time in my life, Michael went on, his voice dropping, there's nothing I can do. I can't buy more time. I can't sign another contract. I can't order someone to fix this. He looked at her, his gaze trembling. All I can do is sit there and be afraid. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She knew that feeling all too well. So can I, she said softly. Michael raised an eyebrow as if he hadn't expected her to continue. There are nights, Sarah said, when I sit beside my son's bed listening to him breathe, and I wonder, if he stops breathing, what will I do? She didn't cry, but her voice sank. I don't have backup money. I don't have power. I don't have anyone I can call in the middle of the night, she said. All I have is being there. And hope. Michael looked at her for a long time, not with the gaze of a rich man looking at a poor woman, but with the gaze of one parent looking at another, someone who had stood at the same edge. Do you know what's the scariest part? Michael asked. Sarah shook her head. It's not losing my child, he said. It's realizing how many days I chose work over him. He swallowed. I told myself I was doing it for him, for his future. But the truth is, I wasn't there. The words fell between them, heavy. Sarah stepped a little closer. She didn't touch him. She sat down in the chair across from him. You're still here, she said, and you still have time. Michael gave a sad smile. The doctors said, I don't care what the doctors said, Sarah interrupted, gently but firmly. I've heard those words before. Michael looked up, startled. My son, Sarah continued, stopped breathing one winter night. They told me to prepare myself. She took a deep breath. That memory had never stopped hurting. I sat by his bed for 6 hours. I told him everything. Things I had never said. Apologies, promises, she said. I don't know if he heard me, but I spoke because I needed him to know. Michael listened to every word. And he lived, Sarah said quietly. Not because of me, but I believe because he knew someone was waiting. Michael lowered his head. His shoulders shook again. This time he didn't try to hide it. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that, he said, his voice breaking. Sarah looked straight at him. You are, she said, because you're his father. There was nothing grand in the sentence, but it carried a strange weight. Michael drew in a deep breath. Then he stood up. He no longer looked like a broken man, just a father trying to stand. Thank you, he said. Not just for the money. Sarah, I nodded. I know. Michael reached out, hesitated for a second, then took her hand. His hand was warm, trembling slightly, a hand used to making decisions but not to asking for mercy. You reminded me, he said, that there are still good people in this world, even when everything else falls apart. Sarah squeezed his hand once, then let go. Go, she said. Your son needs you. Michael nodded. Before turning away, he paused, pulled out his phone, typed quickly, and held the screen out to her. This is my number, he said. If you ever need anything, anytime. Sarah looked at the digits, then back at him. She didn't promise to call. She nodded. Thank you, she said. Michael turned and walked toward the ICU. Each step was still heavy but no longer hesitant. Sarah stood alone in the waiting area, her hands empty. No envelope, no money. But inside her, there was a strange feeling, not quite relief, not the same anxiety as before. It was the feeling of someone who had just done the right thing and was ready to face whatever consequences came with it. Outside, the rain was still falling. But for the first time that night, Sarah felt she was no longer alone in that decision. Sarah stepped out of the hospital when the clock was already nearing midnight. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, separating her from the cold white lights, the smell of disinfectant, and the hurried footsteps inside. Outside, the rain had eased, but the sky was still heavy with moisture, as if the city itself were exhaling after a long, exhausting day. She paused on the steps and drew in a deep breath of cold air. Her chest expanded, then fell. A very ordinary breath, but for Sarah, it carried the feeling of an ending. Or a beginning. She didn't know yet. The envelope was no longer in her hands. Her coat pocket felt surprisingly light. So light, it left a sense of absence. Not because she missed the money, but because For the past several hours, that money had become something to hold on to, a fragile anchor she had clung to. Now there was nothing left to cling to. Sarah walked toward the parking lot. Rainwater had pooled beneath the streetlights, reflecting her image in long, distorted shapes. She caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection, a solitary woman who had just walked away from a decision with no receipt, no confirmation, no promises. She opened the car door, sat down, and rested her hands on the steering wheel. In that moment, all the emotions she had been holding back suddenly rushed in. What if I was wrong? The question didn't scream, it whispered, and that made it terrifying. What if Michael forgot about this once his son pulled through? What if that meeting was nothing more than an emotional moment fading away like rain on glass? What if she had just let go of the only chance to stabilize her life? Sarah closed her eyes. She refused to let herself sink into those possibilities, because once she started, she knew she wouldn't be able to stop. She started the engine. The drive home was quieter than before. The city at night seemed tired, ready to sleep. Shops were closed, signs were dark. Only the traffic lights continued to change colors, steady and indifferent. Sarah drove more slowly, not because of the rain, but because she didn't want to get home too quickly. Home meant reality, an empty refrigerator, unpaid bills. Tomorrow morning, nothing would be different at all. She parked in front of her small apartment and sat still for a few seconds before getting out. The old building, the narrow hallway, the dim yellow lights, everything was so familiar it almost hurt. Her neighbor's light was still on. Sarah knocked softly. The door opened and the familiar kind face appeared. No questions, no complaints about Sarah being late, just a tired but warm smile. "Ethan's asleep," the woman whispered. Sarah nodded, murmured her thanks, and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. She took off her shoes, set her bag down, and went straight into the small bedroom. Ethan lay there, curled under the blanket, his chest rising and falling evenly. The nebulizer sat ready on the bedside table, its indicator light glowing faint green. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and gently brushed her hand through her son's hair. "I'm home," she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. In that moment, the doubts settled. They didn't disappear altogether, but enough for her to exhale. She lay down beside Ethan, pulled the blanket up, and stared at the dim ceiling. There was no background music, no climax, just a mother and the steady rhythm of her child's breathing. Sarah thought of Michael, of the ICU room glowing with light, of the man who had walked back toward his son with heavy shoulders but eyes steadier than before. She didn't know what would happen to them. She didn't know what would happen to herself. But there was one thing she knew with absolute clarity. If time were turned back, if she were standing again before table 12 looking at 10 silent bills on a marble surface, she would still make the same choice. Because there are choices that don't bring safety. They bring only one thing, honesty with oneself. Sarah shifted slightly and pulled Ethan closer. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest, if only for a moment, after a long day. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The city sank into deep sleep. And in a small apartment, a poor woman had no idea that this silence was only a pause before her life turned in a completely different direction. Not because of a miracle, not because of luck, but because of the right choice, made when no one was watching. 3 days passed. There was no ringing phone, no call in the middle of the night, no sign that Sarah's decision had left any mark on the world. Life went on, quietly, relentlessly. Sarah returned to her Wednesday night shift as usual. She put on her uniform, tied her hair neatly, and slipped into the same old shoes with worn-down soles. The kitchen was still loud. Knives are hitting cutting boards. Orders are being called out. Mark's voice barking from the far end of the room. No one knew, and no one needed to know, that just a few nights earlier she had stood before a choice that could have changed her life. She served tables, cleaned and wiped surfaces, movements so familiar they required no thought. But in her chest, there was a small, hollow space. Not regret, but waiting. No one teaches us what to do after we've done the right thing. There is no immediate reward, no applause, only silence, and a fragile faith that the choice mattered. Sarah didn't tell anyone, not out of fear, but because she didn't want to turn it into a story meant to earn comfort. If she had needed proof that she'd done the right thing, she probably wouldn't have done it. Midway through the shift, Mark walked over and tapped the counter with a finger. "Someone wants to see you," he said, his irritation barely hidden. Sarah looked up. "Who?" "He didn't say much," Mark replied. "Just gave his name and said he had to see you right away." Sarah's heart skipped. She didn't think about money. She didn't think about opportunity. She thought of the hospital, of white lights, of a man with eyes hollowed out by worry. She untied her apron, set her tray down, and followed Mark toward the front of the restaurant. And then she saw him. He stood near the host stand surrounded by well-dressed diners. But he didn't look like them. Not because of the perfectly tailored suit, but because his face had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but his eyes were different. No more panic, no fear hanging in suspension. Instead, there was something lighter, brighter. When he saw Sarah, he moved toward her quickly, as if afraid she might disappear. "Sarah," he said. His voice was still hoarse, but no longer trembling. "Are you well?" She nodded, so surprised she didn't know what to say first. "Yes. And you?" He smiled, a real smile. Not wide, not showy, but one that reached his eyes. "My son woke up," he said. "This morning." Sarah instinctively lifted a hand to her mouth. She couldn't stop the emotion rising. "The doctors say he'll be okay," he continued, his voice thick with feeling. "Still needs monitoring, but he's out of critical condition." Warmth spread through Sarah's chest, not because she believed she'd done something miraculous, but because she understood that relief, the feeling of your greatest fear stepping back, just a little. "That's wonderful," she said, and this time, her voice didn't shake. "I told him about you," he went on, as if afraid Sarah might walk away before he finished. "About how you brought the money to the hospital. About how you didn't keep it, even though you needed it." Sarah shook her head lightly. "You don't need to—" "He said," Michael interrupted, his voice catching, "that it was the kindest thing he's ever heard. He wants to meet you." "So do I." Sarah didn't answer right away. She glanced around, the restaurant, the guests, Mark standing a few steps away with an annoyed expression. She felt herself slip back into a familiar place, small, out of place among people with power. "Can we talk outside?" Michael asked. "Just a few minutes." Sarah looked at Mark. He crossed his arms but said nothing. She took a deep breath. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. Mark exhaled sharply but nodded. Outside, the sky had cleared. The sunset painted the glass of nearby buildings a pale orange. The air was cool and clean, as if the city had been washed after a prolonged rain. "I've thought a lot about you," Michael said as they stood a few steps away from the restaurant. "About what you did. About why you did it." Sarah folded her arms across her chest. "I just did the right thing." "No," he said slowly. "You did the right thing when it wasn't safe. He looked at her thoughtfully. Do you know how rare that is? Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to prove that to anyone. Michael reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Sarah froze, instinctively defensive. If that's money, she began. No, he said quickly. It's not money. He handed her the envelope. It's an offer. Not a favor. Not charity. Sarah looked at the envelope in her hand. It was thin, light, and yet it shifted her heartbeat. I need people I can trust, he said. Not the best on paper, but people are willing to do the right thing, even when no one is paying them. Sarah looked up at him. There was no pity in his eyes, only respect. You don't have to answer now, he said. Just know this. Good things sometimes arrive late, but they never arrive without a reason. Sarah held the envelope. Her hand trembled slightly. She didn't open it. Not yet. Because in that moment, what mattered wasn't what was inside the envelope. It was this simple truth. One right choice, made in silence, had quietly changed the trajectory of many lives. And this? It was only the beginning. Sarah held the envelope in her hand and stood still for a few seconds longer than necessary. It wasn't heavy. In fact, it was very light. But her heart wasn't. In that moment, she realized she was standing before another threshold. Not one of right or wrong, but of change. And change, for people accustomed to living in uncertainty, is often more frightening than poverty itself. What do you want me to do? Sarah asked, her voice low but steady. The man standing across from her didn't answer right away. He looked at her, not to persuade her, but as if weighing every word he was about to say. I want you to work for me, he said. Not because I pity you, and not to repay a debt. Sarah tilted her head slightly. She was used to offers that came with conditions, or worse, with eyes looking down from above. But his gaze was different. It didn't carry condescension. It carried choice. I run a large company, he continued. A lot of money, a lot of power, and a lot of people around me, willing to say whatever I want to hear. He paused, took a breath. But you won't. Sarah remained silent. She thought back to the moment she stood before table 12. No one is watching. No one is demanding anything. She had chosen what was right, not because someone would know, but because she would know. I need someone like that, he said. Someone who can't be bought easily, someone who can say no. Sarah lowered her gaze to the envelope. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper, hesitant. I don't have business experience, she said. I've never worked in an office. I'm just a waitress. The man shook his head gently. You are not just anything. He looked at her directly. You've spent years observing people in their truest states when they're tired, when they're under pressure, when they think no one is paying attention. That's a skill very few people have. Sarah heard her heartbeat grow louder, not from pride, but because for the first time, someone saw value in years she had believed were invisible. You won't have to do anything that goes against who you are, he went on. I just need you there, watching, listening, and telling me when something isn't right. Sarah looked up. You trust me that much? He smiled faintly. You brought $1,000 to a hospital at midnight. I don't need any more proof than that. The words weren't poetic, but they struck the deepest part of her, the place that had long doubted whether her kindness would ever be understood for what it truly was. Sarah took a deep breath. She thought of Ethan, of rushed mornings, of phone calls to the insurance company where her voice grew smaller out of fear of being denied, of the constant dread that one slight misstep could make everything collapse. Salary, she said slowly. And insurance. The man nodded, as if he had been expecting the question. A, salary that means you won't have to choose between rent and medication, he said, and full health insurance for your son. Sarah closed her eyes for one very brief moment. There are moments in life when you don't cry from sadness, you cry because of relief. She opened her eyes. I need time to think. Of course, he said immediately. You don't need to answer today. He looked at her thoughtfully. But I hope you understand. This isn't a favor. It's an invitation. And if you refuse, I will still respect you exactly as I do now. Sarah nodded. That respect, unconditional, unforced, was precisely what made this offer different from anything she had ever known. They stood there for a while in the fading light of late afternoon. No hurried handshake, no grand promises. Just a truth slowly coming into focus. A right choice, when placed in the hands of someone who knows how to value it, can become a doorway. Sarah turned back toward the restaurant, passing through the familiar glass doors. Inside, everything was the same, the clink of cutlery, the hum of conversation. Mark glanced at the clock as if to remind her of her place. But something had changed. She walked with the envelope in her pocket, not like someone carrying a secret, but like someone holding a possibility. In the small restroom at the back, Sarah locked the door, sat down on the toilet lid, and opened the envelope. The print was clear, official, unambiguous. She read it, then reread it 3 times. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but because for the first time in her life the future wasn't just a worry. It was a choice. Sarah folded the letter carefully. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was still her, tired, plain, unadorned, but her eyes were different. The eyes of someone who had just understood this. Kindness doesn't make you weak. It's only been waiting to be placed in the right hands. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whether she dared to step through that door. The next morning, Sarah woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm clock, but because she hadn't slept deeply. Morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, falling across the worn walls of the small apartment. Everything looked the same as yesterday. The chipped kitchen table, the chair wobbled slightly whenever she sat down. The bills, neatly stacked in the corner of the table, are waiting for their due dates. No miracle had happened overnight. Sarah stood in the kitchen, making coffee, listening to the soft crackle of boiling water. She glanced toward the bedroom. Ethan was still asleep, curled up under the blanket, his face wearing a rare look of peace. His breathing was slow and steady, the only sound that truly calmed her heart. She sat down, set the cup of coffee in front of her, and took the envelope out of her pocket. The letter was still there. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't turned into an illusion. Sarah didn't open it again. She didn't need to. She had read enough to understand that her life had just been placed at a rare crossroads. But what troubled her wasn't the salary, nor the health insurance. It was a much simpler question. Did she deserve this opportunity? She replayed every moment that had brought her here. The way her hand had stopped before the 10 bills, the drive through the rainy night, the cold ICU waiting room. The eyes of a father were more afraid than anyone she had ever seen. No one had forced her to do the right thing. No one had promised her anything. And that was precisely why that choice mattered. Sarah stood up and walked over to Ethan's bed. She sat down and gently brushed his hair. He shifted, opened his eyes, then smiled sleepily. "Mom," Ethan whispered, "are you going to work today?" Sarah paused for a very brief moment, just long enough to realize that from now on, that question could have more than one answer. "I have a meeting," she said. but I'll be home early." Ethan nodded and drifted back to sleep. For him, that was enough. Sarah straightened up. She took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like she was chasing life anymore. She was walking toward it. That afternoon, Sarah called the man who had stood outside the restaurant a few days earlier. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice calmer than she expected. "I'll try." There was a second of silence on the other end of the line. Then he said simply, "I'm glad." There was no cheering, no grand promises, just a sentence, enough to confirm that this wasn't charity. It was trust, placed in the right hands. Sarah hung up the phone and looked around the small apartment. Everything was the same, but the feeling wasn't. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She would have to learn, to make mistakes, to face people accustomed to speaking in power and money. She would no longer be invisible, and that always came with risk. But she also knew something else. She wasn't entering this new world empty-handed. She carried with her something many people there had lost long ago: integrity. One day, Sarah could earn more money. She may live in a larger home. Ethan may grow up without hearing tense conversations about unpaid bills. But the most important thing had already been decided. At the moment, she chose not to bend down and pick up that money. This story doesn't say, "Do good and life will repay you." There is no such promise. It says something simpler and truer. Doing the right thing isn't always safe, but it always tells you who you are. And sometimes, when you choose to stay true to yourself while no one is watching, life quietly opens doors you never dared to hope for. Money can save a day. Character can change a lifetime. Making the right choice won't make you rich overnight, but it gives you a future you don't have to run from. Sometimes a story doesn't need to end with a miracle. It only needs to end with the truth that kindness still has a place in this world. If this story made you pause for a moment to think, if it made you wonder what you would do in that situation, please support stories of kindness. Share to spread the value of doing what's right. Comment with your thoughts below and subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where we tell real-life stories, not glamorous, but deep enough to stay with you. Because sometimes, a story may not change the world, but it can change a person.